provide a brief overview with some quotations, as I usually do, that I think are pretty salient, and that also might help to kind of focus the conversation, given that there were so many perspectives that were explored in this chapter. But so first, I'll share this quote from the introduction to part 2, which is, "What this book means to show is that philosophy, if it arrives at the point where it understands itself, must lead the spirit to a soul experience that is, to be sure, the fruit of its work, but also grows beyond it." And then further down, this is on page 284 if you have the PDF, that this path, if it is followed through to its end, leads to the experience of a spiritual world, and that the soul through this experience can become aware of its own spiritual essence through a method that is independent of its experience, and knowledge through the sense world is what the presentation of this book attempts to prove. And then, so that's the kind of, the goal of the book that he's reintroducing. And then before getting to some quotes from the actual chapter, I thought it would be worthwhile to remind ourselves of this statement that he makes in the chapter on the Greeks, which is that, so this is page 72 of the PDF. "Greek thought life has an element that makes it appear perfect in the best sense of the word. It is as if the energy of thought in the Greek thinkers had worked out everything that it contains in itself. Later world conceptions have produced accomplishments through other forces of the soul. Of the later thoughts as such, it can always be shown that with respect to their real thought content, they can already be found in some earlier Greek thinker. What can be thought and how one can doubt about thinking and knowledge all enters the field of consciousness in Greek civilization, and in the manifestation of thought, the soul takes possession of its own being." So I was reminded of that part when encountering this moment in the chapter that we read for this week, where I felt like Steiner was making his morphological statement about what he was considering in this chapter was most evident. And so this was on pages 295 and 296. So I have two rather large quotations to share now, but then I'll be finished and we can think about it together. So, in concentrating one's attention on the significance, so before I share this, just consider what I found really interesting about this passage was what he's saying about thought. Given that everything's been sort of, worked out in thought with the Greeks, perhaps, what is thought? What is the service, I guess, or what is thought doing in this age of the consciousness soul, I guess, where the ego is sort of the soul force that is coming to articulation. So in concentrating one's attention on the significance of Hegel's philosophy, one can see how the thought picture that man develops of the world unfolds before him like a plant. One can observe that the development is brought to the point where the seed, thought, is produced. But then this process is brought to an end, just as in the life of the plant whose seed is not developed further in its own organic function, but is used for a purpose that is as extraneous to this life as the purpose of human nutrition is to the seed of the reproductive organs. Indeed, as soon as Hegel has arrived at the point where thought is developed as an element, he does not continue the process that brought him to this point. He proceeds from sense perception and develops everything in the soul in a process that finally leads to thought. At this stage, he stops and shows how this element can provide an explanation of the world processes and world entities. This purpose can indeed be served by thought, just as the seed of a plant may be used as human food. But should it not be possible to develop a living element out of thought? Is it not possible that this element is deprived of its own life through the use that Hegel makes of it, as the seed of a plant is deprived of its life when it is used as human food? And then, so this is the part that especially leaped out to me. In what light would Hegel's philosophy have to appear if it were possibly true that thought can be used for the enlightenment, for the explanation of the world processes, as a plant seed can be used for food, but only by sacrificing its continued growth? The seed of a plant, to be sure, can produce only a plant of the same kind. Thought, however, as a seed of knowledge, could, if left to its living development, produce something of an entirely new kind, compared to the world picture from which its evolution would proceed. As the plant life is ruled by the law of repetition, so the life of knowledge could be under the law of enhancement and elevation, which the law of enhancement reminded me of what in English is translated as intensification in relation to Goethe's just these different features that he's pointed out in plant morphology. So there's like polarity at play, but also intensification. And the word is Steigerung. I'm not sure how to pronounce it.
Steigerung.
How did you pronounce it, Angus?
Steigerung.
Okay, yeah. So I thought maybe that might be the word that Steiner used at that moment, but I'm not sure. And then, so now the last quotation I'm going to share is just at the end of this chapter where he's sort of following up on this earlier statement, or at least as I understand it. So on 331 to 332 to 333, he says, Goethe's thoughts contained the seeds for a continuation of a philosophy that was taken up by Hegel, but insufficiently. If Goethe attempted to obtain a conception with his archetypal plant that allowed him to experience this thought inwardly so that he could intellectually derive from it such a specific plant formation as would be capable of life, he showed thereby that he was striving to bring thought to life within his soul. Goethe had reached the point where thought was about to begin a lifelike evolution, while Hegel did not go beyond thought as such. In communion with a thought that had come to life within the soul, as Goethe attempted, one would have had such a spiritual experience that could have recognized the spirit also in matter. In mere thought, one had no such experience. Thus, the evolution of world conception was put to a hard test. According to the deeper historical impulses, the modern time tended to experience not thought alone, but to find a conception for the self-conscious ego through which one could be aware that this ego is firmly rooted in the structure of the world. In conceiving this ego as a product of material processes, as the materialists did, one had pursued this tendency by simply following the trend in a form easily understandable at the time. Even the denial of the spiritual entity of the self-conscious ego by the materialism of the 19th century still contains the impulse of the search for this ego. So that's all I have to share. Any thoughts? I think this I'm just really curious. I think Angus, you've talked about this in volleys, and I think also in that independent video that y'all made. But just what is thought, especially if if there's already been this statement made by Steiner that thought has kind of worked itself out. What is thought when we're no longer in the intellectual soul age? And anyway, what do you think, Angus?
I'm going to answer first of all with a question to Matt, because I think it's very pertinent to your question. Matt, you called the group Urphänomen. Had you already read this book and understood it as an expression of that when you did it?
No, this is my first time reading it, and I thought Ashley and I came up with the name in dialogue at some point. I'm not sure who it originated between us, but I knew Steiner
because it's a cracking name.
The evolution of consciousness. Yeah,
it's a cracking name. So what's actually happened? Some interesting things have happened to me this week. One of the things I found out was that actually the second part was written in 1900. So he wrote the second part before he wrote the first part. So the way it seems to me at the moment And the way I found out about this, and I'm going to like try and discuss this in a broader context, in perhaps in a different form or somewhere with at another time. But basically, in the sixth lecture in the fifth gospel, he just by the by mentions, oh, by the way, this book of Riddles of Philosophy, it originally was called, I don't have the name off the top of my head, but then what I discovered is that I had to go back and sort of like retrace like how thinking grew from ancient Greek through to all the chapters that we've read. And if you think about it, what he's done is he's taken Goethean thinking, and he's identified like the main characteristics of the development of philosophy in the last 60 years, or is the last 50 years, 1850 to 1900. And then he's done, it's like in true archetypal spirit, he said, this is the flower of something, or this is the fruit of something, or this is the leaf of something, but it's developed out of a system. What is that system? And that's what we've been witnessing. I think something very special has happened in this group. We've grown through this process of seeing this unfolding of a being. I think this is what he's referring to when philosophy understand itself, in the quote that you gave, Ashton, there. But what he's done is he's added layers of detail into there so that we can experience how it's like this being has evolved through time. And he's right at the end of part 2, he's going to lead us to anthroposophy, but he's identifying like how the plant of philosophy, because he uses this metaphor. It's not by chance that he uses the metaphor of the seed and wasted forces being eaten, or whether they can develop further. And he's proposing anthroposophy as a further extension of Goethean thinking. But the wonderful thing that he's done in this book is he's given like a case study in how you apply Goethean archetypal thinking. It's like, take any phenomena and it has its roots in something else, and that also applies to the thinking world. I don't know. That's a little bit where I am. There's so much happening in this book, but I think that's a little bit of what you might have been getting at, Ashton. I don't know if you want to come back to me on that.
Yeah, I think that's definitely the case. Can make a distinction between, I think he's definitely making this distinction just in his method between a history of ideas and the history of consciousness, and that maybe thought serves the articulation in a given age, at least after the intellectual soul age, for the articulation or the bringing into, to serve the bringing into awareness of what is emerging as far as like new soul forces or whatever it might be, into a deeper understanding of that.
Yeah, and he when he was talking about Schopenhauer and Herbart and Schleiermacher and these people, he was introducing us to like these other parts of the inner experience, that the feeling and the will life, which are going to be the areas of action for thought to deepen itself. But he doesn't, and I'm not going to criticize him, but I would love to have had more there. But perhaps it's quite simply that there are so few thinkers that have developed thinking into that area. It's like Goethe is sublime when it comes to it's like using the imagination to arrive at new visions of how these forces form things, how you've got archetypal plants and archetypal animals. but actually we don't see much evidence in the past of where it's going. But there is something. I'm trying to think where I've picked it up. There's a quote that I'm thinking of that I'll just see if I can pull it up. I can't actually give you the source of this. I don't know which conference it came from, but this seems to me to be summarizing where he's trying to go. He says, when we are in a position to assimilate anthroposophical knowledge, not only through reading and listening, and I'm applying his process that he's been going through in this book here, not only through reading and listening, but when we are more and more able to experience the content of anthroposophy in our heart, in our feelings, then it is as if living cosmic beings enter our souls. Then anthroposophy will appear to us increasingly as a living being, and we will become aware that something is knocking at the threshold of our heart saying, let me in, because I am you yourself. I am your true nature, your very humanity. That's where he's trying to lead us in this book, I think.
Can I go? Let me in.
John, I think we have a lineup of a few folks.
Oh, I beg your pardon. I didn't see any
That's
hand.
okay.
Okay.
I don't know if you know how to use the hand raise feature, but it seems like a good way of keeping us.
Oh, I thought we could just chime in
ordered here.
But I'm perfectly willing to wait in line.
Yeah, I want to share a few things, and then I see Teresa and Jonathan with their hands. If you want to do the reactions button, John, you can raise your hand and hop into the queue there. Yeah, Angus, thanks for zeroing in on the name of the group, Urphenomen, which does paint the picture, as it were, of what Steiner is doing here. And it's become apparent to me in reading up to this point how important Hegel is for Steiner. And indeed, it was Hegel who first used Goethe's understanding of plant morphology as applying that method to philosophy. In the preface to the Phenomenology of Spirit, Hegel makes that quite explicit, and was in dialogue with Goethe at the time, prior to 1807, when he published the Phenomenology, about applying the Goethean method. But Steiner, in also applying this method of observation of the morphology of consciousness as it unfolds through these various epochs, is doing so in a much more concrete way than Hegel. It's very schematic in Hegel. It's still, breathtakingly brilliant in the Phenomenology, but very abstract. And at the end of it, as Steiner reiterates in the first chapter of part 2, it dissolves the individual into the world historical process. And as Ashton read that paragraph or two for us about the metaphor of the plant, so wonderful the way Steiner draws that out, that Hegel gives us this seed, which we then, because he cannot go further than sort of abstract thought, which, though it reveals to us the world creative process in our own thinking, is still too abstract and again dissolves the individual. And rather than eat that seed, Steiner wants us to replant it, perhaps in, to extend the metaphor, an etheric soil, where it can take root and grow into a new organ of perception, etheric imagination, right? Which requires individual acts of will and devotion, not just thinking, but willing and feeling, to go beyond the boundary of the sense world, basically. Where though Hegel develops thinking so far, he's as yet unable to, cultivate this higher form of imaginative perception to bring the soul and nature, not just the general soul, but the individual soul, back into touch with the natural world. And one more thing I want to share about thinking, and this came up in the volleys over the past week. I think, David, you raised this point. I didn't get to see all of the replies, but you're concerned, David, about thinking potentially alienating us from reality in some way, which obviously a form of abstract intellectual thought, particularly the strange form of idealism that we call materialism, that thinks it's dealing with the real world out there, but it's actually lost in its own abstractions. That indeed is a dead end that thought can lead us down, where we absent ourselves as a soul with our inner experience of thinking, and imagine we might explain from the outside in how such a soul life could be generated by, brain activity or something. That's what happens when thought becomes overly intellectualized. But on the other hand, as Hegel points out, we can't escape thinking. Even when we imagine that we have, we're still thinking. And so what Hegel allows us to do is take thinking to its end, right? But there it stops for him. But Hegel's perfectly right. We can't view or observe our thinking from the outside as if to know it from the outside, because the instrument of knowing is we're always already engaged in that process of knowing. And so we have to be careful when we imagine that we might escape thinking without, following the dialectic, as it were, to the end of thinking. There is a way through thinking to another mode of being in dialogue with or communion with reality, but it's not an escape from thinking. It's sort of it's the pathway through thinking that leads us back to reality. So I just wanted to throw that into the mix and see what all you think about that. So let's go in order here. Teresa, you're next.
Thank you, Matt. Yes, I just wanted to respond to Angus's comments and how Rudolf Steiner was leading us, cooking us into being. And then I couldn't help but think about or go back to, and I'm not sure, many of you may have come across the life processes, the 7 life processes by Steiner. Yeah, and so the taking in, the observing, the warming, the connecting, the relating, then the nourishing and the digesting, the breaking down. I'm just reading my notes here from a previous, in September, I attended a workshop. Yeah, and then it goes to eliminating and then maintaining and then growing and then reproducing new knowledge. So yeah, I'd love to hear any thoughts on that connection as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Teresa. Jonathan, go ahead.
Teresa, I'm sorry, I can't really answer to that about the life processes. I think Jeff could do that quite well. I'd like to I'd like to, Matt, kind of sort of slightly disagree with you, but with a sort of confession, but that this chapter kind of made me sort of think again about the way I've been thinking about thinking and how I had thought it kind of developed into the new thing. And the passages that Ashton brought up at the beginning really present that beautifully, because the picture I'm getting now, and it's not a complete disagreement, and I'm still kind of unclear exactly the role of thinking in all this, because obviously we do have to think, we think we are thinking beings, so there's no getting around that. But the picture I got is, so there was a life in thinking in ancient Greece, and then ever since then we've actually been feeding off that. So our thinking has not got that life. So instead we're just feeding off that as a seed, instead of letting the life that was in there to continue. And I don't think that's meant to be a bad thing. I think that's a necessary point, because it brings us to this where we're feeding on the thinking. We need that to stay alive while we experience this external world all around us. And in having this externality all around us, we come to ourselves. It's the consciousness of the development of our individual ego. So we need the food, but it is, as we have it, do it, or take it now, it's still just food. And so I think what the chapter's saying is that even Goethe was still coming to it slightly intellectually. And so although he sensed the life and he was seeking to bring the life to life within him, he still hadn't quite got there. Yeah, so I just that really, that's kind of a new thing for me, that there is a role for thinking, and I used to think that we had to kind of take thinking to the limit and then that would bring us to the next point. But now I'm thinking not. You know, we sort of, at some point we're going to have to stop eating, and perhaps with Hegel we can become fully satisfied because, you know, it's such a banquet. And then there's something else. And that, I think there's a kind of like a reversal. But I can't say any more.
I'll see if I can respond to that after John and David go, but appreciate those thoughts, Jonathan. Go ahead, John.
I'm sorry, is it my turn?
Yes. Go
Okay,
ahead.
thank you. Thank you so much. It's a fascinating discussion. I just want to add something. I remember that when I'm reading this, that he lived and died before the atomic bomb. Okay. And just as there are lots of people now who are in their adulthood who were born after the internet. So I remember before the internet, and definitely the thinkers that he's working with are very positivistic, materialistic, and he's doing a sort of investigation of the thought forms that they have created. And he draws a lot on Hegel. But what I find missing in all this is something that I want to update, and that's image schemas or embodied schemas, from which all of our thinking arises. This is developed out of cognitive linguistics, cognitive semantics. So if you use the metaphor, a beautiful metaphor of the seed has an interior, a boundary, and an exterior. So yes, we unfold very much like plants do. And I think the challenge is, as I believe Steiner was a post-Christian initiate, and for all of us who may want to aspire to becoming that, I think we need to really blend in a way I don't think he does in this particular work. In other works, he definitely does. A first person, a second person, and a third person. So I'm repeating myself a little bit here. I'm coming out of Peirce here, who works triadically, but I also want to appreciate that there's other ways, other models of working. So a first person account of a super sensible, of what I think the super sensible that he's trying to describe, philosophical, I think would be helpful here. So I'm going to offer this as a spiritual research, and I'll do it as briefly as possible because I know there are many other thinkers and speakers here who want to chime in. So I am lying down in bed, taking a nap. And as I'm lying down in bed, all of a sudden I'm aware that my feet are walking. They're walking on crunchy gravel. I can hear it. Then all of a sudden I notice as my feet are walking and I hear crunchy gravel that there is a landscape emerging. And I go, wait a minute, I'm asleep in bed. What's going on here? Then all of a sudden I notice the landscape gets more and more crisp and vivid and colorful. And I see a little cottage. I see a pool of water in front of the cottage. And I thought, oh, okay, this is a different world. than the physical world where my body is asleep and lying down. And I go up to the pool of water, and out of enormous curiosity, I put my hand in it and I move it in and out, and I feel the temperature, the coolness, the wetness of it, and compare it to the physical, my physical experience of water. I walk into the cottage. I ask, is anyone here? No one replies. I go over to the cabinet and I open it and I see a glass. I take the glass out of the cabinet, and out of curiosity to see what happens with gravity, I let go of it, and it falls, it hits the floor, and it crashes. I see it crash. And there was a lag time between seeing it crash and hearing it crash. So I saw, aha, there's a difference between this world and the physical world that's asleep in bed. There is a gap between the experience of the auditory and the visual. This was very significant to me. So other experiences happen, but I took very careful notes, and I remembered this experience because it happened like 30 years ago, maybe more than that. But I'm offering it as an example of image schema of the container, of the interior, the boundary, the exterior. In this experience, I believe that I passed through the threshold, that I passed through the boundary, and that as I did so, a kind of re-imprinting occurred in both worlds, because the physical body holds the imprint of these, what I would call imaginal experiences. This is not imaginary, it's imaginal. And I think that's what Steiner was aiming for, a kind of lyric philosophy where the imaginal was not labeled and dismissed as just fantasy or imaginary, because I believe there are objective features to the imaginal. And I believe that's what these image schemas are. The idea that, you know, we walk around, we have feet, we have heads, we have an up and a down. This is the vertical axis. We also have the in and the out, and the moving in and out. And it is these experiences which are embodied that happen at a very young age, are outside of our awareness, that makes all of our thinking possible, makes our communications possible. So I'm just sharing that because I think that Steiner he passed through these thresholds, and he was extremely gifted at it. And he could recognize other spiritual researchers. And he could, as Swedenborg, he recognized Swedenborg's achievement, or attainment rather. I don't think this is an egoic achievement. And I think that kind of interplay between spiritual researchers is extremely creative. And I believe that's happening here. And I would like to nurture that and cultivate that seed and plant it in very healthy soil. Thank you.
Thanks, John. We'll let that marinate, and let's hear from David, Lorenzo, and Jeff.
So just confused as to what exactly our definition of thought is. I've heard from like Noam Chomsky that he called thought language, and I don't know if that's true or not. Like, is DNA language? I don't know if that's true or not. So I'm just wondering what everyone's opinion is as to what exactly thought is.
Well, you compare thought. Were you asking me or just a group?
Everyone.
Okay. For me, thought tends to be in our culture something in our head that's happening in our head. You lie down. If you want insomnia, think about things that happen, and you'll find that your head starts vibrate. But if you pay attention also to your hands and your feet, then a shift can occur so that you can, and I think this is something Steiner recommended. He said the most spiritual part of our bodies is our hands and our feet. I think you can start to blend thinking, thought, affect, emotion. Affect is not the same as emotion. And I think all of these cognitive capacities that are being enriched and enhanced by reviewing Steiner's work, I think we also have to recognize that a lot of his work, I think, is obsolete. but and has been reversed in some areas. So anyway, I'm drawing a little bit from a lot of different thinkers here, so you'll have to pardon me. I'm moving a little faster than I can, my words come out. So thank you so much for that very provocative question.
Yeah, Lorenzo, I'll let you go. Let me just briefly respond to David on this question about what is thinking in your comment, bringing up Gödel's incompleteness theorem. And I take it your concern with the idea that Hegel's system could have achieved completeness while remaining internally consistent. And I think it's a mistake to understand what Hegel was doing as akin to the sort of formal system that Gödel was criticizing. Gödel's incompleteness theorem would apply more to like what Russell and Whitehead were trying to do, grounding mathematics and formal logic in the Principia. Hegel's mode of thinking is dialectical and is, again, driven by the engine of contradiction. And so he kind of, in a way, scooped Gödel. But what for Gödel is a bug, for Hegel is a feature. So I don't think Gödel's incompleteness theorem can be used to say that Hegel's approach to system building in a philosophical context, that Gödel in any way made Hegel obsolete. Though Hegel's obviously a bit more abstract than anthroposophists might like and dissolves the individual, I think Gödel was talking about something else, a different form of, let's call it computer thinking, computational thought, that a form of logic that could be programmed into a computer. You can't program Hegelian dialectic into a computer, right? So anyways, we can talk more about that, but Lorenzo, sorry for skipping in line there.
Nothing. So I just wanted to ask John why he thinks that the gap between the visual and the auditory is significant in dreams, and trying to respond to David's question, I think that there is a difference between the question what is thinking and what is thought. I think that if we just deal with thinking as an activity, we are taking it on the individual side, while in the philosophy, for example, of Hegel, thought is the very substance of is the ground base. So thinking loses its significance in some way. I mean, then you have to use another verb to signify something, and I think that Steiner here is trying to put thought as just one element, not the ground base of everything, and so he gives much more importance to the thinking aspect of it as an activity. Yeah, and John.
Why do I think the auditory and the gap that I experienced in that state between the auditory and the digital, between the auditory and the visual,
Yeah.
is important or noteworthy?
Yeah. Why?
If
I have my own thoughts about that, but I wanted to hear from you.
If I walk into my kitchen in my physical experience and open the door, open a cabinet and pull out a glass and drop it on the floor, my experience has been it crashes and the sound of the crash are unified. In this dream state, they were not. There was a gap, which made me feel, and I'm still working on this, that it was a construction. I do not believe by a physical brain. There may be a relationship or correlation, but I don't believe it's caused by a physical brain. And that, I think, is the big claim I'm making. But I think what these image schemas which I very crudely described, the in, the out, the container, the boundary between the in and out, how pivotal that is, how important that is to us, is almost always out of our awareness, because these image schemas are multimodal, multisensory, I would say multidimensional, and mystical experience and drug experiences and artistic experience and athletic experience. Often there is a threshold that we go beyond, and all of a sudden, very fresh, sometimes liberating, sometimes terrifying experiences can occur. And I believe that very quickly goes back into a norm, conformity, that, and we have amnesia for those peak experiences, but we have a yearning for them as well. And we want to repeat them. Unfortunately, we get addicted to drugs and sex and rock and roll and intensity for the sake of intensity. So I think these more subtle experiences that Steiner, I'm sure, was very careful to describe to probably an inner circle. In his writing, I think and in his speaking, he was quite daring for the time he was in. But I think he was part of that Rosicrucian brotherhood, and there were secrets. And I think he was a part of that. So I think it's a very deep history that this is part of my personal research that I'm working on. So thank you very much for that question. I hope my response was useful to you.
Yep. Just to close, then I'll leave it to Angus. Have you thought about the possibility that since there is probably, some backwards causality movement in dreams, that maybe that the gap had to do with a different flow of time and of the necessity for the visual event to be ended, to the sound to begin, as when we have to listen to the reverse recording of something, we have to wait for it to be ended, of course, to listen to it back. So just food for thought. Anyway, Angus, I'll leave you.
Yeah, I'm going to have a go at giving a part of an answer to David's question, and then I'm going to loop back to Jonathan, something Jonathan shared on Volley, which I think is relevant to this question as well, which is really interesting. So, I mean, going on to like Steiner's ideas of what thinking is, thoughts are shadows. Shadows of what? They're shadows of they're shadows of being that are full of life. We only select see their shadows. And what are feelings? They're also shadows, but not of the astral realm. They're shadows of the lower dimension. And then what are moral intuitions? They are shadows of the higher dimension. So he sees it very much inside. I mean, you can think of Plato's cave also as a way of understanding what Steiner thinks thoughts are. But I really would recommend people have a look at the video that Jonathan linked to on Volley. I can't remember the name, and Jonathan might like to fill in afterwards to say who it is. But he did a wonderful, wonderful job of taking apart one of Steiner's thinking exercises. It's like training exercises for training the imaginative consciousness. And basically, it's sort of like you form triangles in your head, and you keep moving them around so that you've got triangles building in your head. And I'm familiar with this exercise, but this guy has a wonderful way of explaining how what will happen if you practice this long enough. And Lorenzo, if you've ever heard of a guy called Tiziano Bellucci, he talks about it.
No, I haven't.
Have a look him up.
Yeah.
Very interesting Italian anthroposophist. Anyway, so he talks about it. When you practice it enough, it becomes a living experience of all triangles. It becomes a living thought. So if I draw one triangle, well, that's one representation of a concept. And then I can draw another one, and I can draw a billion gazillion different versions of what is still ultimately a triangle. But by practicing this this method that Steiner talks about, and this guy describes in very clear terms, what you're doing is you're training yourself to actually have contact with that living being that's behind the shadow in your thinking. And that's where I, if I can say, that's where I see myself going. With this, one of the questions that become a lot more urgent for me is through reading this book and lots of other things, is how do we, so like, what are the concrete steps we can develop to take our inexperience to a more vital level? And I think what's described in that video is really interesting. And he doesn't actually do just one video on it. He does several videos, and he also references the works that he's building on. So really interesting to look at that from the perspective of a deeper understanding, rather than saying a definition of thinking, and a more complete experience of what thinking can become. Steiner often says, be careful with definitions, because they kill your thinking, basically. He didn't say that, I just said that, but it's like you're putting limits to things, and we need to characterize things so that there's room for them to, those concepts to grow, rather than creating definitions. It's like putting small shoes on Chinese children's feet to stunt their growth. Yeah, but just John, if you could sort of tell people a little bit about Jonathan, sorry, I mean, yeah, tell people about the name so that they can go and look it up or link to it or something like that. I'm sure it's really great value.
It's in the chat.
That's it, I'm done. Teresa?
Is it my turn?
Okay, today I would like to
Oh, hang on, sorry.
investigate the
Sorry.
nature of imaginative variation.
I
that we
have
find
pressed
in
the
Edward
video on the
Husserl's
link,
work,
so I'll just
and also
hop
in a
out for a minute.
Yeah, it's very interesting, the video, because he describes what Angus described, and then at the end, how there's kind of an inversion. And so that then instead of one kind of thinking through to the thing, then something kind of comes through and thinks, I was going to say thinks you. And so with this inversion, you then kind of find yourself outside in the world. I won't say any more. Teresa, go on.
Yeah, sorry. I had pressed the link and then the video came up and it started to play, and yes, messed with my train of thought. Yeah, I just wanted to go back to what you were saying, Jonathan, and how you were saying beyond thinking, and how Rudolf Steiner is leading us into going beyond thinking and looking at Goethe's work and with the stages and just observing, reflecting, imagining, and then using imagination, using intuition, and then ultimately going into insight, where our thinking is put to the side, and we're more so using, if anyone's heard in the Tao and thinking with the heart, where it's, I guess, intuition and imagination are more connected to wonder and awe with the outside world in order to get to new knowledge. So just thought I'd put that in.
John, do you still have your hand up from earlier, or did you have another comment? Is your next?
Am I up next, or is it David?
You're next on my screen.
Okay.
So go ahead.
It's very challenging for me. I have a question. Someone asked, I think it was Jeff, where is the seed to be planted? In what substance? I think that's an interesting question, especially when we're talking about interiors, exteriors, and boundaries between them. And I have a question about world, and whereabouts is world? Does world have a size or shape? What does world want to have happen? So I'm asking perception. I'm asking for questions that have to do with our perceptual system. And I feel like what's being left out in this, in Steiner is, well, yes, it's world and world conception and picture, but what happens to Earth? What happens to planet? What happens to globe? And I think these are very contemporary. We use these words sometimes interchangeably. So when you ask the question, where does the seed get planted and in what substance? I think that's a very deep question. The world is everything that is the case, according to Wittgenstein. But for me, there's a very big difference in world, in planet, and Earth. A very different perceptual experience is evoked by those words, which are not evoked by algorithm and abiotic and the internet. So I have a bit, and the digital. I'm a bit of an oldster here, because I have a lot of trouble with the idea of a metaverse. You just put on goggles and you click your heels and somehow you're in another world. I don't think that's going to replace the subtle realms anytime soon, although I've heard many people claim that it will. Thanks.
Go ahead, David. Are you still muted,
Yeah,
David?
Mike,
Sorry,
Mike, David.
Oh. Well, it's probably for the best. Okay, so I was once sitting around and trying to understand, like, what came first, the thinker or the thought? And, like in the Old Testament, the name of God is like I am or something like that, just a fact of existence. And then the question is who I am. It's like the earliest question I've ever had, like, who am I? Like trying to put an identity to this base fact of existence. And everything in my conscious experience, I can reduce to a computational procedure that generates it. And I feel like that's limited. And I know others might not, but me in my instance of human, maybe I've been roboticized in my life, maybe partially lobotomized or something. But how can I get beyond that in a way that I can have proof that that thought isn't tricking itself into thinking that the thing it's generated is this separate generating entity? Because you know what I mean? I can't get to the bottom of that. Like, it's like this, it's almost like there's a contradiction at the root of existence, and if it's undone, all of existence ceases to be, or something like that. I don't know.
Well, yeah, I can take a stab at that, David. I found it interesting in this chapter when Steiner was talking about, I'm not sure how to pronounce his name, Zolbe, Czolbe, that he had this idea in the mid-19th century about the brain as the producer of thought, and in particular, the circular movement of the parts of the brain. Almost 150, 200 years later, neuroscience, in the attempt, those neuroscientists who do want to reduce thought and consciousness to brain activity are basically working with a slightly more complicated version of the same idea, re-entrant circular networks in the brain that will somehow produce consciousness. And so my answer to your question, how might you convince yourself that your own thinking, your own experience of thinking is more than that, is that if thought were simply a kind of information processing, there's absolutely no reason you should be aware of any of it, right? It could go about its business independent of an experiential horizon, which would be going through that processing. So, you know, philosophers of mind talk about zombies and all sorts of different thought experiments and the hard problem of consciousness and so on. But as far as I can tell, if it were merely these circular kind of self-referential brain patterns, even if there's a circularity there, there's nothing about you know, one network of neurons referring to another network that refers back to the original network of neurons that would give rise to phenomenal experience, right? So the fact that you're experiencing your thinking, to my mind, makes it clear that there's something more going on than brain circles, as it were. I don't know what others think about that. I think Angus, your hand went up next, and then
Yeah, super
Josh.
quick answer to your question there, David. Read chapters 3 to 5 of The Philosophy of Freedom. When you understand that, you'll the material delusions will fall away or run off water like run like water off a duck's back. Chapters 3 to 5.
What do you think, Josh? You're still muted.
Sorry, everybody. I've got the flu, and hopefully this makes sense in some way. But going back to David's questions, but I was thinking about the fact that our consciousness, as it sits now, as we're talking about thinking and thought and the differences between the two, is rooted in a deep time of teleotic happenings or actual occasions that are like far beyond that. Like, for instance, one thing that immediately comes to mind is the 5-HT2C or 5-HT receptors, the serotonin receptors. You know, they were around long before humans, long before brains, and long before our version of consciousness came about, probably. Although there was some element of that, there had to be previously to develop the telos that eventually led to that very receptor also being incorporated into our own neurophysiology in neurons that, you know, probably weren't where the receptor originally was made, if you will, way back millions of years ago. Yet it still gets incorporated into our own minds to be able to bind all kinds of different neurotransmitters, psilocybins, LSD, all this kind of thing that helps, you know, even enhance our consciousness even further now. I think I'm forgetting my train of thought, probably because I've taken a bunch of medicines for this flu, but those are just some thoughts that came up to me with David. Sorry.
All right, Josh. Got 2 minutes. I think, Jonathan, your hand went up. I'll chime in here. And
Yeah. Yes, Josh, I'll just suggest one thing is that receptor, do we know it was here before us? Because we often make these assumptions that, you know, our experience now is what it was like before, just perhaps with more or less bits. It might be that our present consciousness has developed it into the form it is now. That's a suggestion. And to the David question, what Matt's saying, I think it's wonderful because in the book we've been sort of learning that, hearing that the ancient Greeks, thought was living for them, and we've moved into a period where thought is now being experienced. So we're not living it, but we're experiencing it. And David's really like live questions are what's going on in this chapter. This chapter, you know, it's called Der Kampf um den Geist, the war of the spirit, the struggle of the spirit. So that suggesting that there's something in these questions about thinking and, you know, doubt about thinking and circularity in thinking. There's a struggle going on. So I think just like a suggestion for David is that just to understand that that sort of struggle is a certain life that perhaps has a value that might bring you beyond just the thought content that it manifesting.
Well, we've got to wrap up here. Next week we read chapter 2 of part 2 on Darwin, which will be really helpful for exactly the question that Josh is raising. Thinking about the evolution of the brain as an organ, and I think Goethe, Steiner, clearly evolutionary thinkers, but maybe the word involution might be more appropriate for the way that they see other species as sort of offshoots of the human being, rather than the human being being an offshoot of those other species, right? So we'll meet again next week to discuss that. Let me stop the recording.